Hi, welcome back to Plot Twists and Puzzle Pieces. Grab your coffee, your puzzle board, or your paint by number, and settle in for another book chat. Today we're talking about The Wedding People by Alison Espach. The Wedding People follows Phoebe Stone, a mid 30s, early 40s adjunct English professor whose life has unraveled. Her marriage is over, her teaching career is stagnant, and she's grieving the death of her cat and contending with deep loneliness. Hoping for a final indulgence before she ends things, she checks into the luxurious seaside Cornwall Inn in Newport, Rhode Island, wearing a green dress and gold heels, with no bag, no real plan except a decadent night and an exit strategy. But the hotel is not the refuge she expected. It's hosting a 6-day, $1 million wedding for Lila, a very wealthy, brassy, perfection-obsessed bride, and Gary, a widower with a daughter. Phoebe is the only person in the hotel who isn't part of that wedding. She's mistaken for one of the wedding people and soon gets wrapped up with Lila in her wedding. While the book has the trappings of a wedding novel, its true heart is in the messy, quiet work of living again when everything felt finished. Phoebe's arc reminds us that change often comes not when we plan it, but when life unravels our plans, and we have to respond. The wedding, for all of its extravagance, becomes an incidental setting for a far more intimate story of one woman rediscovering her worth and choosing to step back into life rather than walk away from it. Over 900,000 people have reviewed this novel on Goodreads and have given it a stunning 4.09 stars. When Phoebe Stone arrives at the Cornwall Inn in Espach's The Wedding People, she comes with a quiet, devastating purpose to end her life. Her marriage has failed, her career as an adjunct professor feels meaningless, and even her cat's death underscores a life of loss and isolation. Yet by the novel's end, Phoebe chooses to live, not through grand revelation or external salvation, but through the small, messy, and unexpected moments of connection that disrupt her plan. Espach uses Phoebe's transformation to suggest that hope and redemption are rarely the result of epiphany. Instead, they emerge from accidental human encounters that remind us of our capacity to feel and be seen. Phoebe's initial state of despair is portrayed not as melodramatic, but painfully ordinary. Espach situates her depression within the quiet erosion of meaning that accompanies loneliness and disappointment. Her decision to die seems logical to her, a final act of control in a life where she has felt powerless. However, the absurdity of her surroundings, a lavish, over the top wedding full of strangers consumed by appearances, begins to fracture that certainty. Espach deliberately places Phoebe, a woman intent on ending her life, within a setting obsessed with beginnings. The juxtaposition creates both irony and friction. The performative joy of the wedding amplifies Phoebe's despair but also begins to crack it open. The catalyst for change is Lila, the anxious, perfection-obsessed bride who discovers Phoebe's suicidal intentions. Though Lila's initial response is self-centered, worried that a death would ruin her wedding weekend, the two women become entangled in each other's crises. Their uneasy relationship, built on misunderstanding and reluctant empathy, pulls Phoebe into the living world again. Through Lila's chaotic vulnerability and the absurdities of the wedding weekend, Phoebe is reminded of the unpredictability and humor of human existence. Espach seems to argue that redemption often arrives not through clarity but through disruption, through the inconvenience of being needed by, or even just noticed by, someone else. By the novel's end, Phoebe's decision to keep living is quiet and ambiguous. She doesn't experience a miraculous recovery, she simply chooses to go on. In that subtlety lies Espach's insight and hope. It is not the denial of despair, but its coexistence with it. Hope, in The Wedding People, is less about being saved and more about staying curious, about people, about one's own story, about what might happen next. Phoebe's redemption comes from recognizing that life, for all of its absurdity, still holds the possibility of surprise. In The Wedding People, Espach departs from conventional portrayals of depression by resisting the familiar narrative arc of illness, revelation, and recovery. Instead, she presents depression as an ordinary, ambient condition, one that coexists with humor, social interaction, and the small absurdities of daily life. Phoebe is not trapped in a purely tragic or clinical portrait of despair, She's a woman who still notices the ridiculous, the beautiful, and the ironic, even while contemplating her own death. These layered portrayal challenges the expectation that depression is always dramatic or visibly catastrophic. Unlike many literary depictions that isolate depression as a purely internal struggle, Espach situates Phoebe's pain within a larger social and cultural context. Phoebe's despondency stems not only from personal loss, the divorce, her career stalling, but also from the quiet humiliations of being undervalued and unseen. By placing her in the middle of a lavish, chaotic wedding weekend, Espach highlights how depression exists alongside and sometimes beneath the rituals of normal life. The setting's exaggerated cheerfulness makes Phoebe's sadness both more absurd and more human. It suggests that despair doesn't always look like darkness and silence. It can exist amid music, laughter, and champagne flutes. Espach also subverts the traditional redemption arc often attached to stories about mental illness. Phoebe's survival is not presented as triumph or clarity. Her decision to live is understated, born from small, accidental connections rather than sweeping moments of grace. In doing so, Espach portrays depression not as a problem to be solved, but as a condition that can coexist with humor, empathy, and uncertainty. Espach masterfully balances dark humor with the weight of grief and depression, creating a tone that is both unsettling and deeply human in The Wedding People. Through Phoebe's wry, self-aware narration, Espach transforms despair into something sharp-edged and strangely alive. Phoebe's observations about the absurdity of wedding rituals, the petty anxieties of the guests, and her own failed life invite the reader to laugh even as we recognize the pain beneath her words. This uneasy blend of humor and sorrow mirrors the psychological reality of depression, the way laughter can become a coping mechanism, a way to keep feeling when everything else has gone numb. Espach's humor never trivializes Phoebe's suffering. Instead, it makes it more accessible. By allowing Phoebe to find irony in her surroundings, the lavish wedding she crashes, the neurotic bride who becomes her unlikely lifeline, the reader sees how wit can coexist with despair. The humor exposes Phoebe's intelligence and awareness, reminding us that depression doesn't erase a person's ability to perceive or to engage with the world. In fact, her darkly comic lens often reveals just how deeply she feels. The effect of this tone is profound. It keeps the novel from descending into hopelessness while maintaining emotional authenticity. The reader experiences Phoebe's pain without being overwhelmed by it, sensing that her humor is both a shield and a sign of life. Espach's use of dark comedy ultimately invites empathy rather than pity. It allows us to understand that even in her lowest moments, Phoebe remains perceptive, human, and capable of connection. In this balance between tragedy and wit, Espach captures the strange truth of survival. Sometimes laughter is what keeps despair from closing in completely. In The Wedding People, Espach crafts a story that is at once darkly funny and achingly tender, a portrait of a woman on the edge who learns, almost by accident, how to keep living. Through Phoebe's reluctant entanglement in a stranger's extravagant wedding, Espach exposes the fragile absurdities that shape modern life, the pressure to appear happy, the quiet loneliness beneath success, and the way grief can coexist with laughter. By weaving humor through despair, Espach refuses the easy dichotomy of tragedy and comedy, suggesting instead that both are essential to survival. Phoebe's transformation is not dramatic, but deeply human. She doesn't find perfect happiness, only the courage to stay curious in what comes next. In the end, The Wedding People is less a story about weddings than about the complicated act of choosing to live, about rediscovering connection, meaning, and even humor in the most unlikely places. Thanks so much for watching this episode of Plot Twists and Puzzle Pieces. If you enjoyed diving into today's story and want to keep unraveling more hidden meanings, character arcs, and wild twists, make sure to hit subscribe and tap that notification bell so you don't miss what's coming next. We'll be back next Wednesday with another deep dive into a story. Next week, we'll chat about Red Rising by Pierce Brown. Until then, keep connecting the clues and uncovering the pieces that make every story unforgettable. See you next week.